Hey, podcast friends. It's such a delight to reconnect to my colleague from many moons ago, Peter Coleman, who, just for the record, is not my relative. Our paths crossed beginning sometime around 1995 at the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, the ICCCR at Teachers College, Columbia University, where we worked together on many cool initiatives until I left around 2003. My partner, Ellen Rader, with whom I had been delivering intercultural negotiation programs around the world, brought me into the center after connecting with Mort Deutsch, who is often referred to as a grandfather of conflict resolution and perhaps the grandfather of conflict resolution, at least in the West. At the center, Ellen and I created the first certificate program in conflict resolution at Teachers College, which included collaborative negotiation, mediation, and then a growing list of related and interesting skill sets like using large group methods to resolve conflict and create systemic culture change. At the time of my arrival, Peter was a graduate student, Mort Deutsch's protege, and I watched him rise to where he is today as head of the center and now a well-respected social psychologist and researcher in the field of conflict resolution and sustainable peace, probably best known for his work on intractable conflict. Prompted by the publication of his new book, The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, I asked Peter to join me on the podcast for a conversation and draw from his book, his work, his life, anything that feels most relevant to him to address the role of gender, gender equality, gender transformation, and its connection to building a more peaceful, democratic, and sustainable world. He agreed. We had a great conversation, which we bring to you now. As those of you who have followed me on this podcast know, I, along with many, believe that getting gender right, the role of gender, moving beyond outdated patriarchal structures, is the foundational challenge to building a much more peaceful, sustainable, and pleasurable planet for humanity and other living creatures. By way of example, allow me to repeat the poignant and on-target words of Shabana Basic-Rasik, I don't know if I'm saying it right, who is the co-founder and president of the School of Leadership for Women in Afghanistan, who said recently in the Washington Post, educated girls grow to become educated women, and educated women will not allow their children to become terrorists. The secret to a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan is no secret at all. It is educated girls. That statement makes me want to cry. You know, it's just a tragic but accurate comment after the countless lives lost, the total pain for so many Afghans now, and the trillions, I think 21 trillion, my country, and I will say just wasted in our 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, which by the way, the costs were so intelligently tracked by the Costs of War Project, who we had on this podcast a while back. Military interventions or policing are not generally the best solution to conflict. Genuinely meeting people's needs is. It's not that complicated, but moving beyond the money that drives the choice of using force is, and we need to figure that out like yesterday. So here are some of what I call my favorite frames from Peter's and my conversation, reminiscing about our early years at the ICCCR and a moment when we had a room filled with teachers, guidance counselors, principals from all the 188 New York City schools, which is the largest school system in the country and perhaps the world, who were convened to learn critical negotiation and conflict resolution skills. It was awesome. The seeds that were planted in Peter to do a life's work in the field of peace and conflict, his reflections on himself as a 7-year-old, the influence of being raised by women, turbulent times in Chicago, the presence of Martin Luther King, the what he calls macro worry that began to build in his young awareness of social justice issues and the related conflict about them. A conference he convened to change the conversation from quote unquote negative peace, like addressing violence prevention and atrocity mitigation, to positive peace, like creating communities that will foster harmonious relations in which destructive conflict is far less likely to erupt. It's kind of why I moved from doing mediation, pure mediation, to more upstream organizational mediation using OD methodology, organization development methodologies, or getting conflicting parties to focus on the positive thing they are trying to create versus the negative thing they are trying to avoid, or like in the health field, focusing on what creates health and allows humans to flourish rather than having a disease orientation. It's an energy follows where we place our attention kind of idea, which is super important awareness. Anyway, Peter's conclusion was that the conference was a huge failure because no one wanted to talk about positive peace, with the exception of Doug Fry, who we also recently interviewed on this podcast. And how at that same conference, he had invited Abby Disney, the creator of the amazing film series Women, War, and Peace, who kept raising her hand and saying, I don't want to be the gadfly, but how can we talk about the mitigation of violence without talking about gender and men and their role in it? We shared our appreciation of the Sebastian Junger's 2016 book, Tribe, where he reported a profound observation how many early American settlers that had been captured by native tribes, when given the opportunity to return to the European colonies, didn't want to go back, without exception, because they preferred their lives among native communities. And I guess the frame that most stands out to me, and unfortunately is a discouraging one, Peter tells the tale of working with the amazing Lema Gowie, who I've mentioned many times on this podcast, to create a women, peace, and securities program at Columbia that would provide technical and financial resources to some amazing younger women, I think mostly in Africa, who have been doing peace building work, like the badass Ria Uyada, who I interviewed a while back on this podcast. In spite of the huge need for the program and the thousands of applications to it, the program sadly is closing this year. And that's in spite of the fact that Lema is Lema, an amazing woman, a Nobel laureate. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, watch Pray the Devil Back to Hell, a documentary created by Abby Disney about how Lema and other women, in a way that only women can pull off, brought an end to the Liberian Civil War. The program wasn't able to raise the 25 million needed to keep it open in perpetuity, which is it sounds like a lot, but it's a paltry sum given the amount of money, the billions that are flying around this planet. And this was in spite of the fact you couldn't have a more compelling person spearheading the program, the poster child of the Melinda Gates Foundation, of Oprah. And that's not because of any shortcomings on Lema's part, but much more about where our level of consciousness is about what's going to create a world that we all want to live in for the next number of centuries. It's a fact that reinforces my belief that women really need to get our, what together when it comes to money and how it's being spent. As I mentioned in my episode about women, money, and power with Barbara Stanley Hewson, women, at least in the United States, and maybe even globally, are coming into huge financial resources. Some say we will have the majority of the financial resources in the 21st century. This is, I'm guessing, mostly white women in the United States sitting on so much dough that if we chose to actually use it in powerful ways, we could really make a big difference to the world our kids are inheriting. As Barbara said, and I'll say it now, women's issues with using and taking charge are the resources we have access to, has little to do with our capacity and a lot to do with our ambivalence about power. So many of us still want men to take care of money for us, and we got to stop it. We got to stop doing this. Anyway, there are many more great frames from this conversation, including insights about women in negotiation, constructs about the masculine, the feminine in war, and what it's been like for Peter as a tall, white, good-looking dude working in a cauldron of conversation around conflict, peace, social justice, and identity. So thank you, Peter, and I hope you all enjoy this rich episode.